Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I want to talk about a graphics card from a generation that I don't feel like I hear too many people talking about anymore. This is an RTX 2080 from Nvidia's 20 series of GPUs with their Turing architecture. Released in September of 2018, this card comes with 2,944 CUDA cores, 368 Gen 2 Tensor cores, and 46 Gen 1 RT cores. It also has 8GB of GDDR6 VRAM on a 256-bit bus, which is actually a lot better than a large portion of low to mid-range graphics cards from the last generation or two. This means that, particularly with the new AMD cards, which are still running GDDR6 memory, this card has much more available memory bandwidth, which can actually be a surprising advantage that this older card has over newer ones. In any case, I'm actually not going to be pitting this card against any other new graphics cards today, as I don't have any cards to test it against. Instead, I'm just going to be benchmarking this card in 5 modern games, with some ray trace tests in there to really stress out its first generation RT cores. And then you can decide if the performance offered by this card from this generation is interesting to you based on the prices that they usually go for. I'm going to be testing this card in a system which is running a Ryzen 5 9600X, which has both PBO and the 105W TDP mode enabled. And this CPU will be paired with 32GB of 6400 megatransfer per second CL32 DDR5 memory. I set all of this hardware up as an open air test bed on my desk initially to get my test started, though I did actually end up transferring it to a case a while into my testing. After I had all of the hardware set up, I proceeded to get a Windows 11 installation media plugged in so that I could get the computer up and running and ready to be benchmarked. Now, if you're watching this video, there's a solid chance that you might be thinking about buying a card from this era to make some sort of a budget PC build with. And if you are, or even if you just work with PCs in general, activating Windows is a crucial part of the process and a part of the process that can get costly if you're buying keys from places like Best Buy. So I want to tell you about today's video sponsor, KeysFan. KeysFan is a retailer of digital software keys that offers great discounts on many different softwares. You can get activation keys for Windows 10 and 11 for really great prices, and they even sell keys for software like Office 2019, Office 2021, and Office 365. To order a software key from KeysFan, just select the product you want, add it to your cart, and apply either the code CHT50 for 50% off Windows licensed keys, or CHT62 for 62% off of Microsoft Office keys. Then select a secure payment method like PayPal, Pay, and the keys will be delivered to you shortly after. Thanks to KeysFan for sponsoring this video. Check out the links in the video description for more. Now that my Windows install is all set up and updates and drivers have been taken care of, I can move on to testing the 5 games that I've selected to test for this video. I will note that none of these games are incredibly recent AAA titles because I don't own any of those games. However, I still feel like the library of games that I chose should give a pretty solid representation of what this card is capable of in 2025. The first game that I tested on this card was Forza Horizon 5. This is a semi-new, pretty well optimized title, and it's also one of my personal favorite games, so I like to test hardware with it. At 1080p, which is the resolution that all of the benchmarks in this video have been run at, this card was able to push out 96 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 77.9 and a 0.1% low of 59.4. This was all at the high preset, with short motion blur and no ray tracing. So a pretty solid performance out of this card in this title, and 96 frames per second feels absolutely great in this game. Moving on to the next title, Halo Infinite, this graphics card still showed no signs of struggling when running this game at the high preset at 1080p. In an arena map in training mode, this card put out an incredible average of 162.4 FPS with a 1% and 0.1% low of 138.2 and 130.1 FPS respectively. This indicates not only a great overall performance in this game, but also an incredibly stable performance, as these percentile lows are not far off from the average frame rate that we were seeing. Really impressive, and this card would actually be great for playing Halo competitively due to that really stable frame rate. Now in Far Cry 6, this card once again provided a great showing of its capabilities, and at 1080p with the high preset and no ray tracing, we got an average frame rate of 125.5 FPS and a 1% low of 72.3 FPS and a 0.1% low of 39. So in this case, it wasn't actually the most stable performance in the world, but it was still miles off from being anything close to unusable. Notably, this game is one of the few ray tracing tests that I'll be running on this card in this video, so once I'm done going through all of the rasterized performance numbers, we'll actually be coming back to Far Cry 6 to see how this card can handle modern ray tracing with its older RT cores. Now moving on to probably the hardest game in my test suite today to run, that being The Last of Us Part 1. This game was notorious when it came out for being poorly optimized and especially for requiring a lot of VRAM to run. So let's see how this 8GB card from 7 years ago can handle it. Running The Last of Us at 1080p with the high preset and ray tracing turned off, this card pushed out an impressive 93.1 FPS on average with 1% and 0.1% lows of 64.3 FPS and 59.7 FPS. So even though this was supposed to be the game that would bring this graphics card to its knees, I have to say, I'm thoroughly impressed with its performance in this title. This card absolutely shredded this game, and I would be more than happy to play this game at this frame rate. Going into this testing, I had been expecting this GPU to get maybe 50 to 60 FPS on average in this game, and so this is a very pleasant surprise. On to the penultimate game in my test suite, Spider-Man Remastered. I would have loved to test out the new Spider-Man game that came out in January of this year, but I missed the Steam summer sale for it, and so I don't own it just yet. In any case, being a 2022 title, it's not like this game is old, and so it should still be a good test of this graphics card's performance in modern gaming. With the high preset at 1080p, no ray tracing or upscaling, and dynamic resolution scaling turned off, this graphics card ran the game at an average frame rate of 142 FPS. An incredibly strong showing once more. The 1% and 0.1% lows were 77.4 and 60.9 FPS respectively, and this makes sense because there were some somewhat large stutters when loading into a big part of the city. However, I've experienced similar stutters on other, more powerful systems, and I think this might be more indicative of the game rather than the graphics card. And finally, we're on to Satisfactory, which funnily enough, even though it's a game that has been in early access for longer than these games have been out, this game is now officially the most recent release on this list of test games. Having officially released in September of 2024 and utilizing Unreal Engine 5, this game might actually prove to be a bit of a challenge for this graphics card. And while this game certainly did end up being a bit heavier on this GPU, with it only being able to manage 106.3 FPS on average at 1080p with the high preset, I have to say that this graphics card is definitely the little GPU that could. This is still a very solid performance for this title, and I'd be more than happy to play like this, especially because this game really doesn't have much fast action in it, and therefore a higher frame rate isn't that beneficial. The 1% and 0.1% lows in this game are really quite negligible due to this game's stuttery nature. However, I will still provide them as data points on screen. Keep in mind, these data points really shouldn't be applied to this card, as basically any system that runs this game has similar lows, even if it's got an incredibly high-end graphics card in it. So, to conclude the results from the rasterization tests that I've run for this video, this card is still an absolutely awesome choice in 2025 if you can find one for cheap used. I managed to find this card for $180 shipped, which is a great price for this card. And although the 2080 itself is a bit less common to find, both the 2070 Super and 2080 Super perform pretty closely to it and are much easier to find. Personally, I'd much rather have a card like this over one of the more modern offerings such as the RX 7600 or RTX 4060 due to the higher memory bandwidth and the fact that, at least according to online benchmarks, this card performs very similarly to them while costing way less if you get it used. However, this card and its siblings aren't all sunshine and rainbows. There is one major downfall of this card, and that is the fact that it has first generation ray tracing cores, which should be significantly less performant in ray traced applications than more modern ray tracing cores. I still want to know if this card is capable of doing ray tracing in modern games while still holding a decent average frame rate, so let's check it out with just a few benchmarks. I only have 3 properly ray traced benchmarks for this video because while Forza Horizon 5 and Halo Infinite have ray tracing, Forza's ray tracing doesn't apply in regular gameplay, so it's basically not even there 99% of the time. Plus, Halo Infinite's ray tracing only applies in the campaign, which performs so differently from the multiplayer maps already that I have to re-benchmark the non-ray traced tests in the campaign mode for the numbers to make sense. Satisfactory just doesn't really have normal ray tracing available either, so that's also off the list. Therefore, we only have Far Cry 6, The Last of Us, and Spider-Man Remastered to work with, but we should still be able to see the performance of these ray tracing cores across these two titles. In Far Cry 6, at 1080p with the high preset and RT enabled, as it is by default in the high preset, this card dropped its average from 125.5 FPS to 68.1. Ouch. Still a playable frame rate, but definitely a massive performance hit, especially for having changed only a single setting. The 1% and 0.1% lows of course dropped as well, all the way down to 23.3 and 7.7 FPS respectively. Interestingly, the performance in this game was fine for most of the benchmark sequence, but at the end where the camera pans out, the performance tanked massively to the point where I wouldn't even call it playable. I don't know if this is some bug with the benchmark or something that could happen in regular gameplay, but it is something to keep in mind, and I'm sure that's where these percentile low figures stem from. In The Last of Us Part 1, with all of the same settings as before, but this time with the ray tracing options enabled, the 2080's average went from 93.1 FPS to 92.7, which is such a small difference, it feels as if it's within margin of error. I almost wonder if this game doesn't have a full ray tracing implementation, like Forza Horizon 5, as it really seems like there's nothing more running on the card. The percentile lows were also within margin of error, being 63.6 FPS as the 1% low, and 58.7 as the 0.1% low. Moving into Spider-Man, a game where ray tracing can actually make a semi-noticeable difference if you're looking for it. Due to the sheer amount of glass windows in this game, the performance hit was much more stomachable than in Far Cry. The average dropped from 142 FPS to 116.5, and the percentile lows went from 77.4 FPS to 69.1 FPS for the 1%, and from 60.9 FPS to 55.1 FPS for the 0.1% low. And that wraps up all of the benchmarking in this video. So what's my final verdict on this card and its two similarly performant siblings, the 2070 Super and 2080 Super? Well, I think that if you can score any one of these cards between 180 and 220 US dollars, you'll have done super well at getting a great 1080p gaming card in 2025. In fact, with the performance numbers that I've seen in all of these games, with the exception of Far Cry 6 with ray tracing enabled, I think that this card is more than capable of being a killer 1440p card. Maybe in some games you'd have to drop to medium settings, but I think that in all of the games that I tested today, this card should be able to pull off 60 plus frames per second in all of them at the settings that I ran them at today. And this RTX 2080 is now going to find a home in my girlfriend's PC, along with some other parts that you saw in the testbed earlier. I think that she'll have a great time playing her games at 1440p on this card, and I think that for $180 used, this was an awesome find and way better than anything I could have gotten new. Well, that's all that I have for you in today's video. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy it and maybe even learn a thing or two. In any case, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.